few days ago, on a walk from Chalfont and Latimer to Chesham, a walk I've done 100 times at least, a song came up on my 1722 liked songs Spotify playlist, which I had playing on random at the time. The song was Bill Callahan's Riding for the Feeling. The song always makes me think of Roz, as it was Roz who introduced me to the song 4 years ago in a message that she sent my way on Hinge. Seems like you're a riding for the feeling kind of guy, she'd written, including in her message, the first of many, a link to a YouTube video of that incredible song. Of course, I immediately matched with Roz, not least because Roz was beautiful and intelligent and had better music taste than I had, but also because nobody on Hinge, then or since, has ever engaged in a conversation with me on the app in the way that Roz did. None of the usual bollocks of seen any good shows lately or how's your week going. Right from the start, we were always talking about topics that were meaningful to us, without any hedging on either side. Every woman, no matter what she brings to the table, is a princess on Hinge, sovereign of her curated realm, and every man her supplicant, juggling cleverness and sincerity in the dim light of his screen, waiting for the signal that he has been chosen among the thousands of interchangeable contenders for a fleeting chance to hold the princess's hand. Roz, though, had a kind of nerve and verve which seemed different, a spark that made every other exchange on Hinge seem pre-programmed by a sort of committee. And I liked that. I liked that a lot. Oh, fuck, I thought. She's the one. Don't fuck it up, Steve. Please don't fuck it up. I didn't get this feeling, this sense of excitement and possibility on Hinge that often. The last time, a few years before, had been with Natalia, who, truth be told, as wonderful as many of her qualities were, was never as interesting to me as Roz. Roz would later tell me that this was because Natalia was most likely a self-preservation Enneagram 9 with a 1 or an 8 wing. Hard to tell with 9s, they drift between their wings perhaps more fluidly than most types, and a 6 fix to boot. In other words, a stickler for order and tidiness, a quiet reformer intent on restoring balance, especially in the men that she dated. Natalia's ego cage, or egoic engine, was about maintaining symmetry and calm, preserving peace at any cost, even if that meant retreating behind her wall of silence whenever a conversation veered away from the perfectly smiley, sweet, and agreeable. Natalia couldn't really handle feelings, mine, hers, or anyone else's for that matter, whereas Roz, it turned out, was also a riding for the feeling girl, which is to say, an Enneagram 4 type. Although within this particular ego cage of the 4, she would patiently explain to me on our first date using the language of belly buttons, she was an innie 4, a self-preservation 4, whose emotional life turned ever inwards, coiling and condensing itself into private meaning, an inner compost heap of feeling, you might say, marinating in silence and inquiry, or even inquiry, which is how Roz said the word, whereas I was more of a outie 4, a one-on-one or sexual 4, whose emotions were always careering towards maximum intensity, intimacy, connection. I knew nothing of the Enneagram at that point, other than having skimmed its Wikipedia entry while we chatted on Hinge and deciding, based on the thinness and vagueness of what I found there, that it was probably just another piece of claptrap New Age nonsense for people who hadn't the patience or the intellect to grapple with anything serious in the fields of world literature, analytic psychology, object relations phenomenology, or the mystical tradition. The kind of people who wanted the language of depth without having to bother too much with the rigor of excavation, confrontation, unraveling. An ego psychology light, maybe even another kind of astrology, a psychology for the semi-literate, a sort of tidy cosmology for those who couldn't stomach the mess of their own unconscious. I was wrong, as it turned out, but at that moment I dismissed it entirely, the way one dismisses anything that feels too simple to be true. Before Roz ever explained the ego cage of 4 to me, she issued a warning. She often did this, saying that she was a gangster type when it came to relationships. I asked her what she meant by that, and she explained that when things were good, she was all lightness and charm, the perfect girlfriend, but at the first sign of trouble, she would cut ties to preserve her independence. This, she explained, came from her strong self-preservational instinct, the part of her that needed to protect the quiet order of her inner world. In terms of the diamond approach, she explained, the self-preservation instinct was the guardian of her essential autonomy, the inner sentinel that safeguarded what her teacher, Almaz, would call her own ground. It was the quiet, ever-present voice that warned, "Be careful what you enter into, what you give away, what you give over, for every text, every call, every outing depletes your energy. Every connection carries with it the seed of obligation, as well as relational accountability, a subtle tether that might tip the delicate balance between self-serving presence and other entangled absorption." It wasn't detachment for its own sake, but rather a kind of inner economizing, a way of conserving essence, of keeping her life force from being squandered on exchanges that might drain her vitality or blur the boundary of her own being. But this was also influenced by the riding for the feeling part of her. Because when the feeling she had about another person changed or soured in some way, she had no choice but to follow it. If the feeling told her to run, to cut ties immediately, she usually would, and did. Which was also the Hinge experience through and through, as well as 21st century late-stage relational capitalism. Avoidant attachment styles rule on dating platforms, also because, after a decade of micro-betrayals, ghostings, and half-connections, the women who utilize this gamified intimacy technology have learned that self-containment is the only stable currency that they have left. Vulnerability has become too expensive, intimacy too high a risk in an economy of infinite choice. So women, in the last 2 decades, at least it appears this way to me, have perfected distance as their defense, their aesthetic even, curated warmth, controlled availability, the art of almost, but not quite. The logical endpoint, perhaps you could say, of a culture that craves the simulation of closeness without the risk or the revelation that true intimacy perhaps demands. Roz's acknowledgement of her attachment style on our first date was also, I guess, her first warning shot, one I heard but chose quite willfully to ignore. Because in person, Roz was the least gangster individual imaginable, which is to say that I felt immediately comfortable, unusually so, relaxed in her presence, and she, I think, in mine, though one can never really tell with these sorts of things, since what we take for mutual ease is often just the temporary alignment of two nervous systems pretending to be at peace. Perhaps I felt this way because Roz, as is the case for many self-preservation falls, are possessed with a sort of steadiness of energy, a kind of unhurried composure that never feels like withdrawal, but rather like containment, as if she were holding something valuable and would not spill it carelessly. Self-press fours are sometimes called the glad fours, to distinguish them from the mad fours, the one-on-one types, that would be me, and the sad fours, those ruled by their social instinct, perpetually and forever burdened by their lack of embeddedness, their tribeless and unmoored state. SP4s, self-press fours, don't flare outward like the sexual fours, but rather seem to glow inwards, contained and containing. And it's perhaps this containment which feels safe and welcoming to people like me, who are always burning a little too hot for our own good. Roz had that. She was sensuous, but not performatively so, self-possessed without seeming guarded. She listened with her whole attention, that calm, feline focus that made you feel both deeply examined as well as deeply accepted and even appreciated. Perhaps this is why so many of us marked by the temperament of the four are drawn sooner or later to therapy, either as consumers or practitioners. Left to ourselves, we are chaotic creatures, misaligned instruments, too porous to bear our own sensitivity. But give us a formal place in which to direct our often unstable sympathies, a chamber in which feeling can be transmuted into understanding, and we become curiously precise, but also deeply warm and loving in the process. It is perhaps the one silver lining to being such a truly shitty and fundamentally narcissistic type of person. In such moments, our disorder, you might say, finds an order, and our excess, which in private corrodes us, in the presence of another can often redeem itself into care. This is how it felt for me at the time to be in the company of Roz. Yes, she talked tough about ex-friends and ex-lovers, how easily she'd dispatched with them once they'd revealed themselves to be less than she'd hoped for, how little she cared now for their feelings or explanations. I know this makes her sound imperious, even a little cold, but perhaps because she was a fellow four, and thus spoke my native tongue, that full-blooded, take-no-prisoners dialect of radical authenticity, I found her stories from the battlefield of Eros not tragic but hilarious, and sided with her completely on why these arseholes deserved their swift dismissal, struck from the record the moment they ceased to nourish whatever inner necessity Roz required of them. I wished I could be as ruthless, as decisive, as self-preserving in my own emotional life, but there the fault line between us started to show itself. Our instincts, and perhaps too subtle differences of sex, made us opposites in the same design. She armoured by containment, me exposed by my own unguarded transparency. Roz's byword for relationships was the Gestalt prayer, which she liked to quote whenever she could. I do my thing, you do your thing. I am not in this world to live up to your expectations, and you are not in this world to live up to mine. You are you, and I am I, and if by chance we find each other, it's beautiful. If not, it can't be helped. I always thought this was just Roz talking big, but she meant every word of it. If she was bored of you, or if you irritated her, or if something more interesting appeared on the horizon, she would cut you loose as a friend or a lover, fully expecting that you might do the same. Anyway, that's how we met. Our first date was a walk near Potter's Bar. Roz lived there with her mother, and from the beginning it was clear that she would not be travelling even the smallest distance to meet me. If I wanted to meet her, if I wanted to encounter the one in the flesh and win her favour, I would have to make the pilgrimage to Potter's Bar, a modest but necessary act of devotion to see my newly appointed Enneagram guru who I had been talking with on the phone for the last few weeks. I'm trying to remember how she first unpacked the 4 archetype to me. I remember her talking about essence as well as what she called the soul child. She said that at birth each person has an essential nature, open, radiant, unguarded, but that over time, through early attachments and disappointments, this essence begins to contract. This contraction, this self-armoring, she said, forms what she called the egoic engine, a kind of automatic propulsion system that takes over when we lose touch with our natural state. Each of us, she said, ends up pushing a certain kind of rock uphill, our own Sisyphean labour, endlessly, compulsively, believing it to be freedom or choice, when in fact it is only the compulsion to remain as ourselves. The Enneagram, in her words, was simply to be understood as 9 different ways of describing how we push, Sisyphus-like, our rock of self up the hill again and again and again. Less pathology, more poetry. 9 laments, you might say, for lost essence. So, one spend their life pushing the rock of their being, thinking, doing, saying the correct thing, forever polishing the rock, trying to roll it in a perfect line. 2s push the rock of being needed, which feels to them like love, but is really a kind of control. 3s push the rock of achievement, endless image management, social media, all very 3. 4s push this rock of identity, right, up the stupid and inconsequential hill of the self. Striking rock, moody, heavy, utterly personal. We decorate it with these very deep meanings, call it authenticity, but it's really just another way of staying separate, a sort of tribe of one. She went on. 5s push the rock of knowing, which is smaller than the others, but they never put it down. 6s push the rock of safety, believing that if they keep it moving, the ground won't give way beneath them, even though the rock and the ground are different entities, and they get all anxious and worried about this. For 7s, their rock is freedom, which is why they run ahead of it so that they don't have to feel its weight. 8s push the rock of power, big, loud, visible. If they stop, they'll feel small, and that's unbearable. And 9s, well, they don't so much as push the rock, they sort of nudge it, tending the rock of harmony, keeping it rolling smoothly so that no one starts a war, least of all inside themselves. And there you go, she said. 9 ways of staying super egoically busy so that we don't have to feel the original loss of ease, of contact with God or being or whatever name we give that first intimacy with reality. None of this is evil or fallen. It's simply habitual, what happens when essence forgets itself and starts trying to manage existence. The work isn't to get rid of the type, but to recognize the trance of it, to catch ourselves in the act of pushing the same old rock up that same old hill, and for a moment, perhaps not to push, although where does that leave us Sisypheans then? That's basically the Enneagram path in elevator pitch form, she said. Awakening through seeing. Of course, the speech I've written here doesn't sound half as good as it did when Roz said it. Roz had the spiel. She had trained in all of this and used it for life coaching and consultation work. Ros had a way of making it all cohere together: psychotherapy, attachment theories, object relations, archetypal psychology, diamond approach, mysticism, even neuroscience, into a single, fluid, oddly convincing whole. She could take what I had spent years studying in those other domains, the languages of the clinic and the seminar, and make them seem provisional, fragments of a larger design. The Jesuits, she once told me, yes, the actual Jesuits, had even used the Enneagram for spiritual formation and psychoeducation in the 1970s and 80s, so as to help priests very quickly and very effectively read the souls of their parishioners. Such a strange lineage, the Enneagram: mystics, cult leaders, ascetics, and Californian therapists, all carrying that same diagram in their pockets like a secret map of the human heart. For me, that first conversation was incredibly illuminating. I'd gone into psychology and psychotherapy, as so many of us emotionally or cognitively dysregulated fuck-ups do, because I wanted to understand my sad self better. I knew my attachment style, my object relations, my complexes, my childhood trauma inventory, every schema, every diagnostic and developmental way of describing my existential confusion and misery. But the Enneagram, as Ros spoke it, offered, it seemed to me at the time, and still does so now, a single architecture that gathers all of these fragments into a kind of coherence. For someone who had lived up till then by small gleanings, it was like hearing the whole chord at last. It really was a kind of revelation. And it was liberating too, because psychotherapy, for all of its intricate compassion, is mostly built on vagueness. The idea that we are infinitely complex, unknowable, a stew of culture, chemistry, and chance. You finish the 50-minute hour, and by and large are probably still a mystery to yourself, only now poorer. The Enneagram, by contrast, said, no, you are actually a relatively simple entity on an egoic level, almost insultingly so. You have one main engine, and that engine is largely driven by a single passion, whether that drive is known to your consciousness or not, with two further ancillary centers of intelligence propping the main one up. All three run on one kind of fuel: your need to survive as you. The way you do one thing is the way you do everything. Your patterns of thinking, feeling, acting, they aren't infinite, but patterned, predictable, almost pitifully mechanical at times. For Ros, this wasn't cynicism, but compassion. To know your pattern, your type, was to know your suffering, and thus to observe it was to begin to loosen that knot. When she informed me of my own ego cage, when she said, yes, you are the one who feels everything a little bit too much, who turns pain into identity, who dwells in the aesthetic as anesthetic, I believed her completely, because it mapped with unnerving precision onto my life and inner world. I think I also believed her, wanted to believe her even, because I realize now that Ros was offering me a kind of faith, a psycho-spiritual faith with a geometry behind it rather than a dogma with observation instead of confession. For me, who had spent years inside the old religions of the mind, who had been trained in all the creeds and catechisms of modern secular psychotherapy, I wanted that. So yes, I think this is when I became, as I used to joke to her later on, a born-again Enneagrammer. She had laughed at this phrase at the time, but she knew what I was on about. She had taken the same path. Ros and I did kiss briefly on that first date. Feelings were running high, but the kiss itself was, if I'm honest, somewhat unsatisfying, muted, restrained, disengaged in that careful way that reveals more about a person than passion ever can. I took it as a sign that Roz was not, or not yet, sufficiently attracted to me, and that it might be wiser to cultivate something else between us, a friendship perhaps, or even a kind of Enneagram siblinghood. Neither of us was close to our actual siblings, and both of us, in the transient hot and cold landscapes of Eros, longed for a form of devotion that wasn't contingent on sexual charge, that felt steadier, less mercenary. We both wanted, I think, the kind of love that sits between categories, what she might have called real relatedness, the recognition that there is something more durable, even sacred, in being understood than in being desired. The other kind of love, that love with a small l, we might say, the ordinary transactional kind we mostly have in our lives, is more an arrangement of mutual appetites, a temporary reprieve from loneliness. But this love, the one we both longed for, was more like a kind of shelter, something that might protect us from the cold expanse of ananke, of necessity, of the indifferent universe itself. And that's how it began, an intimacy without much contact, a tenderness without too many demands. For the next 3 years, Roz and I would orbit one another in that odd, asymmetrical way that suits certain temperaments, which is to say, in a way that suited Roz. I see it now, having just read Jonathan Franzen's Freedom, as eerily akin to the love triangle at the centre of that novel. Walter wants nothing more than Patty, wants to be the man she can love, yet in so doing devalues himself in her eyes, since she holds absolute power over his longing, and like most women, finds such unqualified, dog-like devotion faintly intolerable. The moment a man's heart is fully hers, she no longer wants it. Patty, for her part, desires Richard Katz, the cool, dissolute, spiritually hollowed-out figure who incarnates everything that Walter disavows. Roz was equally clear-eyed about who she wanted, and in the next few years would move through a succession of crushes and short-lived, volatile entanglements with men from her Diamond Approach group, the spiritual enclave that had become by then her home, her little Enneagram 4 theatre, her very cosmos. Wanting, perhaps, to be loved by Roz on her own terms, I read several of her guru A.H. Almas's books in the years that followed: The Pearl Beyond Price, The Point of Existence, Facets of Unity, anything that touched even obliquely on the Enneagram. I found lots of it to be profound, even useful, though I was never able to develop that filial devotion to Almas that Roz had. Roz wanted a partner who shared her devotion, who could meet her in what she called the work, capital W, fully and consistently. In our last phone call, about a year before she died, she told me that she'd cleared her shelves of everything else, all the Ken Wilbers, Eckhart Tolles, Assajolis, Horney, Wellwood, Hillman, Naranjo, all of that loose Californian Esalen Institute syncretism, gone. Gone. In her small room, her monastic cell, there was now only a single shelf of Almas, each volume annotated, read and reread until the spine gave out. I had never been inside that room. I was never invited for tea, nor to help her and her mother in the garden, though I'd once offered. Yet I could picture it clearly. White walls, the quiet of devotion, the faint scent of incense, that solitary row of books on the single shelf. It made her, if anything, more interesting to me, more lovable, the sister I had always wanted and would never quite reach. For our connection, such as it was, existed entirely on her schedule. Every few months, sometimes 3 or 4, sometimes 6, she would call. Often it seemed as a kind of afterthought, and I would answer with the same pleasure each time, grateful just to hear her voice. Over those years, we met in person only twice, maybe 3 times after that first date, and I would always travel to her. I didn't mind. When you care for someone, not sexually but spiritually, shall we say, when what you want is proximity, resonance, connection more than anything else, you accept this asymmetry as the price of admission, and I did. I wanted only to remain in Roz's orbit, to listen, to share what was happening in our separate lives, to feel that reciprocal recognition that is its own form of intimacy. And perhaps, I thought, for the first time in my life, I had found someone who met that desire, always under her rules, but that was okay. The cardinal rule for us was very simple. Unless she called me, I was to leave her completely alone. Occasionally, I sent her an article or a piece of writing that I thought she might enjoy, that might spark a dialogue, but she very rarely responded. And when she did, the response consisted, usually, of no more than a few self-preserving words. Roz preferred to talk about the work, her inner life, mostly, I realized, with those inside her inner circle, the initiated, the ones who attended the weekend retreats and international gatherings, traveling wherever Almaz went, the way disciples once trailed a prophet through the desert. This kind of scene wasn't foreign to me. I had spent years in similar settings. For nearly 2 decades, I had been a serious practitioner of Vipassana Buddhism, attending long retreats, sitting in silence, chasing the faint promise of awakening, etc., etc. I knew the culture, the hushed reverence, the quiet competition of egos disguised as humility, the strange, erotic undercurrent of spiritual life. I had always half hoped to meet someone myself who shared that faith, that devotion to the inner life. Though in the British Buddhist circles that I frequented, everything, on the whole, felt a little bit antiseptic. No sex please, we're enlightened, also British. The diamond approach, by contrast, seemed looser, stranger, more permissive, perhaps because Almaz's teachings, an alloy of Sufism, depth psychology and Western mysticism, treated desire not as contamination, but as a kind of doorway. Of course there was room, Roz told me, perhaps based on her own brief, turbulent love affairs with her diamond geezers, for eros in the work, because desire, properly understood, was simply the soul's hunger for its own source. Often, Roz would call me after she had ended another of her entanglements. She'd describe how she hated men, how all these fucking diamond geezers, as she called them, used her as a kind of toilet for their semen, how she had told the last one, an Enneagram 5, an academic, to fuck off, pleased, almost relieved that she could still do so without remorse. She was, in that sense, yes, a true gangster of the heart. No whining, she said, no dragging it out. She told me these stories the way other people recount their dreams, curiously, almost diagnostically, as if testing her own response to see whether some sort of empathetic feeling had returned or not. I never felt threatened by these stories, these other men. I wasn't one of them. I was her brother, her Enneagram 4 brother, sharing the same egoic DNA. Also her Gemini brother, both of us born under the same sign, though we laughed that we had no need for astrology when we had the Enneagram. Those years deepened my own obsession. I read everything, even tangentially connected to the Enneagram. Karen Horney on neurosis and our strategies of self-protection, Fairbairn and Winnicott on internal objects and the false self, Melanie Klein, Bowlby, Kernberg on attachment and the architecture of early love, Gurdjieff and Ouspensky on the original esoteric enneagram of transformation, Oscar Ichazo, who first linked the ancient symbol to personality in the 1950s at his Eureka Institute, also the great Claudio Naranjo, who imported that knowledge to Berkeley in the late 1960s and gave it psychological flesh, and of course Rosa's own guru, Ali Hamid Almaz, who had folded all of the above into his diamond approach, turning typology into a path of spiritual inquiry, individuation, and enlightenment. I read them all. The Enneagram was also reigniting my own passion for self-inquiry, for therapy itself, which had become a bit stale to me over the preceding decades. Yet I noticed that none of my clients seemed to share my curiosity or even passion. They preferred the language of complexity, the fashionable uncertainty of the therapeutic age. In an era of podcasts, YouTube panels, and bite-sized psychoanalysis, the dominant story is that the human being is infinitely intricate, unfathomable, a unique constellation of trauma and culture and brain chemistry. Human beings are like those blind men patting their way around the elephant, each with their own small idea of what they're touching, each reluctant to be told that all of it belongs to the same animal. The Enneagram, in its blunt simplicity, offered the opposite view, that we are patterned, predictable, largely mechanical, especially when it comes to our own personal suffering. I came to see each client as a variation on these 9 types, 9 engines housed in different stories. I soon, though, stopped talking about the Enneagram in our sessions. Too much of an essentialist, soul-led paradigm for those who were paying me to help them deal with the psychological fallout of their egoic selves, as well as various circumstantial entrapments. But when I would reread the transcripts of our discussions, I could always see those archetypal patterns running like unconscious fault lines through all of our words, could see with new clarity how the 3 centers of intelligence, head, heart, and gut, worked so proficiently within the human animal, each striving in its own way to make sense of a world that never quite fits. The head types, 5s, 6s, 7s, seek security, stability, the safety of knowing where they stand. Their primary affect is anxiety. They live in the realm of ideas, scheming ways to manage their uncertainty. The heart types, 2s, 3s, 4s, seek validation and love, the assurance of significance, a mirror that says you exist. Their affect is shame. They live in the emotional field, trying to be seen in the right light. The body types, 8s, 9s, 1s, seek autonomy and control, a sense of agency that keeps them from dissolution. Their primary affect is anger, often buried. They live in the physical world, where will substitutes for understanding. To see these patterns again and again was to feel both wonder and fatigue. I realized that, like Freud's patients, my own were not really seeking transformation, although they said they were, so much as relief from their own egoic engines, endlessly revving against the bars of the cage. The cage, depending on one's vocabulary, might be called reality, God, or ananke, necessity, that unyielding structure of things that does not care whether the car keeps driving or breaks down altogether. To live at all is to inevitably collide with ananke, with necessity, and to name the engine, as the Enneagram does, is only to illuminate the inevitability of the crash. In the end, I came to a strange peace with all of this. The Enneagram might not be the ultimate truth of the psyche, but it is at least honest about our predicament. 9 ways of circling the same mystery, 9 maps of exile. It doesn't promise rescue, only recognition, and perhaps that is enough. It was certainly enough for me, and also for Roz, although nowadays I don't allow myself to talk about the Enneagram to anyone other than God and Max and, well, you, FP. About a year ago, Roz met Gullin, a man from Iceland with a name that translates literally as golden. For, if you're moving in diamond approach circles, if your life's work is the pursuit of inner gold or the inner diamond, to be literally called gold is, of course, to be somewhat, shall we say, anointed from the start. I say this, as you can probably hear, with that familiar mixture of admiration and, more so, envy that you would expect from a type like myself. Gullin is tall, lithe, handsome, and young. 20 years younger than me, 10 years younger than Roz, and, crucially, fully ensconced in the diamond world. Gullin's whole life, in fact, revolves around the diamond approach. I found him as soon as Roz had revealed her crush online and watched a video that he'd posted on his YouTube channel, a 3-hour recording of Gullin carrying out his PhD viva. There he was, leaning back, sipping tea, unbothered, while this international panel of professors quizzed him about the subtle phenomenology of essential states, about the interplay between the pearl beyond price and the narcissistic wound, etc., etc. Gullin, through all of this, looked super chilled, as if the whole thing were just a fireside chat. I thought he must be a 9. He had that 9-ish calm, that tranquil unflappability that people like me mistake for depth. 4s and 9s, though they're opposite in tone, are often drawn to one another, the intensity seeking the calm intrigued by the flame. Roz was no exception. She met Gullin first in the Netherlands, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, some Dutch city, I forget which, a place they had both flown to so as to sit quite literally at the feet of Alma's. Later they met again in warmer climes, perhaps, and by then the gravitational pull of Eros had set in. Roz, who was editing her newly established Enneagram journal and podcast, suggested interviewing him. He responded by writing a few think pieces for her. These interviews also went up on his channel, a cross-pollination of the modern spiritual variety, and before long they were not just exchanging drafts, but fluids. I honestly thought that was the end of my contact with her. But she did call me, I think, once, in her heady summer of love, to give me an update. She told me that she was thinking of perhaps spending half the year in Iceland now, and we spoke of the pros and cons, the practicalities of that. Knowing her, I knew that she wouldn't call me from there. Still, a few weeks before she left, I decided to phone her. No answer, but an email arrived an hour or so later, effusively lovely as ever, but also. And that's where we left it until a few days ago when I found myself thinking of her again and went looking online, as I always do, for traces of Roz and Gullin. I started by checking the journal. Roz had sent me a few months of it for free when it first came out, but stopped thereafter, expecting, I guess, that I should also have to pay the ridiculously overpriced $30 that she was charging for each digital copy of it, Enneagram 4 brother or not. I saw that no new articles had appeared since August 2024, and then clicked on the masthead, and there it was, the death notice formal, sparse, unreal. She will be dearly missed. She had been in Iceland with Gullin. They had gone on a pilgrimage to one of those infamous black beaches that can be found out there, the one made famous by the tourists and all the warning signs. The sand volcanic, the sea furious. It made a sort of sense that they would go there, for people steeped in the language and the symbols of the diamond approach. Black sand isn't just black sand, it's the prima materia, the base matter of transformation, the substance before the light, the dark that births the diamond. To stand there, to be there, is to enact the myth of descent, of annihilation and return. But the sea around Reynisfjara is treacherous. There is much talk of sneaker waves, which sound almost playful, but a sneaker wave is a monster. It sneaks up on you and drags you out with the full, indifferent strength of the Atlantic, of necessity, we might say. And that's exactly what happened. Rez was caught by a sneaker wave, carried off, or surrendered to it. Gullin tried to save her, or half-tried, but his self-preservation instinct kicked in and he stumbled back to the beach. And that, FP, was the end of Roz, which also marks the end of the Enneagram for me, or at least that which can be spoken about it, this being my last public utterance on the topic. The night I found out that Roz had died, I had a dream, or perhaps it was one of those lucid half-dreams where you're aware of the fiction as it unfolds. I was at a Bill Callahan concert, though it might have been an early smog gig. I wasn't in the audience, I was somehow on stage, well, not on stage, more like behind it or in the wings, in that space reserved for the hangers-on, the technicians, the roadies, which felt entirely appropriate. I had always been in the wings of Roz's life, never invited onto the stage, but more tolerated at the periphery. The dreamer, the dreaming subconscious, as ever, was unsentimental in its staging, precise, ironic, mercilessly apt. The band were about to play the song Coyotes, and I was watching, waiting, wondering which version they would do. I could see the set list taped to an amp, and then the first notes started to come, but they didn't sound like Coyotes. It sounded more like Harvest Moon, with that lovely, welcoming Harvest Moon lilt, that tenderness and the almost unbearable plea, "Come a little bit closer, hear what I have to say." A very 4-ish, 2-ish song, if there ever was one. For is this not what sexual falls are always doing, beckoning others towards their intensity, begging to be met there in some way, usually unsuccessfully? For who, after all, let's be fair, wants to come closer to this abomination, this voice? No one. And of course, viewing and listening figures back that up. There is data on this score. And yet, standing there in the wings, I thought, I don't know, maybe this is my moment. Not to talk to Roz, I mean, she was gone, irretrievable, but to say something to the absence that she had left behind, to the field that she had occupied in my imagination for all of these years. Maybe this was to be my Kaddish for Roz, my elegy, or maybe just another narcissistic performance of self-soothing through spectacle, the usual business of turning loss into some form of art. But in the dream, it didn't feel grandiose, it felt necessary. Okay, I thought, okay. I think I can finally sing our song, the 4th track on the album. I thought of Mark and that summer afternoon in which we tried to film an episode for his podcast Guitar and Pen, me having convinced him to sit and listen to an old album that I'd made in my 20s. Watching the footage, I cringe now at the spectacle of it all. A middle-aged wannabe, me, trying to pass off nostalgia as insight, the hunger to be witnessed, masquerading as a creative offering. Pitiful. Pitiful. But it's what we fools do, right? Textbook. Confusing confession with communication, exhibition with connection. Something a little bit tragicomic in it. Perfectly aligned, of course, with one of Franzen's Enneagram 4 characters, good old Richard Katz in Freedom. Expression as both wound and balm, our instinct to turn pain into performance, mistaking revelation for recognition, the telling for the being seen. It is stupid, it is pathetic, it is pathetic. But what can you do? You live the ego cage you were born into, or had to build, or that was built for you. You live it, you study it, you practice every form of spiritual gymnastics to loosen its grip, but mostly, you endure it. You live your book of disquiet and try somehow to make that your art, if you're a 4, as self-indulgent and embarrassingly, idiotically human as that confession might sound. Mark was surprised, I think, that I actually had some music in me and that the music I had sounded halfway listenable to his ears, and so he suggested we write an album together, an album of songs about the Enneagram. I said, yes. Of course I did. And of course I never followed through, busy with self-inquiry or self-inquiry, too occupied with the sacred act of navel-gazing. But in the dream, standing behind that amp, hearing the opening bars of Coyotes, I felt I could step out and sing that song. A kind of surge, a sort of absurd confidence that I could maybe, I don't know, put some voice to all of this, to Roz, the Enneagram, to envy, faith, death, the whole caboodle. It was as if I'd been preparing for it all along, as if everything, the largely fruitless therapy I'd had, the typing, the long letters to the dead, had all just been a kind of rehearsal. And so I stepped onto the stage and began to sing.
man.